Hello and welcome back to Lorehammer. I'm your host, Mark. On this exciting bonus episode, oh man, we got one incredible guest, and then we also got Christian. Welcome, Christian.
Thanks. I thought you were going to introduce me as an incredible guest. I was going to jump in
No,
there.
God, no. The incredible guest is none other than Rick Priestley. Hey, welcome to the show, man. What an honor and a privilege to have you on.
I'm honoured to be here as well, Marcus and Christian. It's lovely to get to see you at last.
Yeah, like what a trip, man. I remember just being an 11-year-old boy, flipping through the White Dwarfs, and I'd find little quotes of you. The one quote I found, though, is pretty kind of funny, and I kind of based a lot of my tabletop gaming off of it. It was like, there's two types of people. There's people that follow the rules, and then there's people that like to have fun. There's something along those lines where
Did I write that?
yeah, it was a random quote in a White Dwarf that kind of stuck with me, and that's kind of paraphrasing it for you. But yeah, you were one of the main guys at the very early inception of Warhammer 40K fantasy, and yeah, it's crazy to think how much influence you've had on the world just through this silly tabletop hobby game. You've connected so many people, and all this kind of, we've spent thousands of hours now just painting miniatures together, and all these kind of crazy things that's kind of spawned off your brainchild.
I guess so. You have to blame Brian Ansell, if anyone, because I joined Citadel, as it was then, in 1982. So I'd be 23 years old, pretty much straight out of college. I did a year out doing mostly archaeology. I was an archaeology student.
Oh,
so
cool.
I spent a year messing around, digging holes in the ground. Discovered I didn't much like that, mostly because of the weather. Rains a lot in England.
Yeah. No, you got to go do that in like the Amazon or something with the nicer weather.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that might be a bit nicer. But as it was actually it was a very hot summer, as I recall. But nonetheless, I thought, I'm not enough. I've had enough of this being outside in the rain business. So I took the job at Citadel. I'd known Brian Ansell for a few years, because my friend Richard Halliwell and I, we'd met Brian in the late 70s, and he helped us to publish our first set of Wargames rules.
Cool.
So
yeah, like
we've done bits and bobs of work for him.
Who was kind of like the original founding crew? You've mentioned a couple names now. How many people kind of were there to start?
Yeah, maybe a dozen.
Okay.
Maybe as many as that, of which 3 would be girls who packed. There'd be Diane in the office, there'd be Brian, then there'd be 2 or 3 casters.
Cool.
And the rest of us were, I did mail order. I was mail order. And the rest would be just packing trade orders, and we had one chap who made molds, but I don't think he was actually employed, although he was a mate of mine. A chap called Paul Elsey, when I first joined.
And you kind of knew some of these guys before you joined up a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I
always kind of just picture, like, me and Christian, we were young boys, and we would just hang out in his basement and talk Warhammer for hours and hours. And what about this scenario or this scenario? And I imagine it was a very similar vibe of just brainstorming and putting together rules and lores, or just whatever.
I guess because when we were we were really quite keen gamers in our teens, but of course in the 1970s gaming wasn't in any way cool. Or something that
it still isn't. Let's not get carried away.
It is. I go into Warhammer World. Well, I've not been for a long time now, but you go into Warhammer World, and you see all different kinds of people playing games. Old people, young people, boys and girls, all sorts of things. In my day, it was very...
Yeah, it was the basement dweller, for sure.
Well, and there was still the stigma of playing with toy soldiers, which certainly, just gaming has become quite a cool thing these days. And video games have helped to make that the case. So,
yeah.
So, it was a sort of tight community of wargamers. And I think I was a little bit younger, by about a year, than some of my other friends. So by the time I went to work at Citadel, I already had 3 friends, including Richard Halliwell, if you can say he worked there part-time, who were associated with it. So it wasn't hard to get a job there. It would have been harder, in fact, it was hard for me to get a job anywhere else. so I'd hair down to my waist at the time.
Interesting.
It was just something which I fell into. In fact, I tried not to do it. Brian Ansell offered me the job doing mail order several times, and I went in and did mail order part-time for him occasionally. But it was a distraction because I was trying to make a living as a figure sculptor at the time.
Interesting. Like this almost like sounds like this was a very unintentional side tangent that took 30 years of your life type situation.
Yeah, it was a bit.
That was never part of the life course originally, you know?
No, funny, isn't it? I mean, what had happened was I was sculpting my own range of spaceships, and I'd written a game to go with these spaceships called Rogue Trader, and it was a sort of raiding trading game based on spaceship combat, but with a huge role-playing element. It's a bit like Traveller in some ways. It's sort of inspired by Traveller, although not a role-playing game. It's a tabletop game with models. And that was the original Rogue Trader. And when I joined Citadel, I really wanted to get that game in production. So part of the deal was that I'd come in, I'd do the mail order on the basis that as we built up a publishing business, because that was what Brian was interested in at the time, we would eventually do Rogue Trader. Well, we never did Rogue Trader, but we did what became Warhammer 40k.
Yeah, like in a weird roundabout, you still did do Rogue Trader,
Yeah.
but the original first edition Rogue Trader sounds very different than the spacefaring RPG that you kind of had in your mind.
You know why? I actually did write that game, and it was going to go into that book.
Yeah.
But we just didn't have room for it in the end.
Interesting.
We kind of ran out of space, and I ran out of energy, so it would have been another 30 pages at the end.
Those Rogue Trader books are packed with information, and they're so
Yeah.
different than modern 40k with the way they worked. Like the rules, I don't want to use the word clunky, but I will. Like the rules were so clunky and dense, and like there's rules for all these different terrain features and all these different side rules, and like it was very personal, man. It was so cool.
Well, yeah, and it had a big narrative element of play, didn't it?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
I remember I did a great big sort of subplot table, and I went around the office and asked everyone to come up with an idea. So that's why there's sort of like 100 ideas in there. All quite interesting.
No, it was sweet though. Like the narrative play, I think that's something too that we don't get as much of, where we're not told as much nowadays to make up our own rules and implement them into 40k. Come up with your own quacky rules and see what happens for your narrative play. Like that used to be a big thing in White Dwarf, where you're flipping through and you find this new unit and it's a little lore blurb, it's little rules, and then you get to build it, and it turns out to be a deodorant land speeder.
I still have that. I should have brought it.
It was a very different, quirky kind of day and age back then, where you could get away with a lot more.
Well, I had to do that because when I'd finally got the go-ahead to write that game, because there wasn't any enthusiasm for it from Brian Ansell was really running the company at that time. Games Workshop, originally Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston, based in London. They always ran Games Workshop as a separate business to Citadel, and I joined Citadel. And if you look at the original Warhammer, the fantasy game, it's a Citadel publication. It's not Games Workshop. And when Brian took over Games Workshop, he kind of toyed with the idea of renaming it Citadel, but in the end, because we had Games Workshop written above the names of all the shops, of which there were about 6 at the time, odd to believe, isn't it? He said, well, it's far too expensive, we'll stick with Games Workshop. So although people go on about Games Workshop being, started in 1975 by Steve and Ian, the reality is that the Games Workshop of today was started by Brian Ansell and Steve and Ian as Citadel Miniatures. And that's the company I joined. To get back about the Rogue Trader, there was no real enthusiasm at the time to do a science fiction version of Warhammer, apart from me and a few of my mates. So it was very much an indulgence, and the only reason I got to do it is because we took on some staff from TSR, who then got to write all the role-playing stuff. The idea was that role-playing was the thing that was going to make money. Warhammer role-playing.
Okay.
And I'd done the original role-play book mostly. I kind of finished the text. It actually got finished by the role-playing team, but I'd largely finished it. And they continued to add all of the classic, and I must say very good, material for it. So things like the Empire, the Enemy Within campaign, for example, that was all done by that new team, which meant I didn't have to think about role playing. It wasn't really my strong point anyway. So I was freed up to do something else. So I persuaded Brian to let me do Rogue Trader, and he said, "Yeah, Warhammer 40k as it became." And he said, "Yes, you can do it, but we're not going to make any. We're not going to make many models. In fact, what we'll do is we'll produce a whole series of weapon packs, and people can convert their fantasy models. So you've got to make it compatible with that. And we don't think for a minute we're going to be making vehicles or anything like that, or team weapons. That's why all in the original Rogue Trader, all the heavy weapons are like shoulder mounted, one figure.
Okay, interesting.
Because no way we can't afford to make team weapons because it's 2 or 3 pieces. Mad, Priestley. Nobody's going to buy this nonsense.
Yeah,
that's funny how the constraints there like kind of created like an evolution in design for you guys. Like, yeah, and to this day they still like the Space Marines are all typically shoulder mounted weapons. Yeah,
it makes sense commercially. What it did was it meant that a lot of things that were I didn't get to make the decisions, if you see what I mean. So the fact that the aliens are fantasy creatures in space was because we weren't going to make any aliens.
right. You had to use what you had.
Yeah.
You had to use what we had. Yeah, exactly.
What a different time and setting. Like, there's so much similar in Rogue Trader, but it also is so different. Yeah, bring your lizardmen over. Slap on a shoulder-mounted las cannon, and you're good to go.
No worries.
No worries here.
It did change very quickly. I think what happened was, as soon as Rogue Trader, that first edition of 40k, came out in 1987, it very quickly became a different game. 2 things happened. It sold like Billio, so suddenly everyone was looking at it. Whereas before, people weren't paying attention because it was just this mad thing Rick was up to in the corner. And by the time it was published, I think that we already realised there was a bit of a headwind behind it.
Yeah.
But very quickly that meant that people started paying attention. So lots of new things came out, and Brian saw it as a vehicle for some of his own ideas. And he in particular would have things made, models made, and then they'd land on my desk or somebody's desk, and we'd go, "What was this then?" It wasn't as if I was in the driving seat in terms of the models.
Yeah.
Because that was never going to be the case. It was always, you always tended to design the games to promote the models. The idea of making models to promote the games was not something we did until way later.
Yeah, like I feel like that is kind of the flow chart of it. It's like, I haven't worked at GW, so this is kind of just what I've heard from yourself and other people, where it's like, you get a miniature slapped on your desk and you're told to write some lore about it. And you're like, well, what is this thing in the first place? Primaris means, what are we talking about? Well, write some lore about it.
Yeah, and often the guy that's put it on your desk doesn't know.
Yeah.
In those days anyway. So it's like you go, "Oh, I don't understand what's going on." They're much more joined up nowadays. They wouldn't go. But in our case, it was White Dwarf's going to press. White Dwarf's going to press at 5:30. It's now 2:00. Here's your new thing. It's called this, that, or the other. We don't really understand. We need some rules for it. And that's how it was done. But this idea of things being play tested and balanced like an intricate piece of clockwork, and it having to work in the context of a one-on-one game with strict rules and setups, and no way. It just wasn't that the world that we were operating in.
Yeah.
We had a phrase. It was, I think it was Andy Jones that came up with it. Andy wrote a few things for us, including what did he do? He mostly did the secondary games. Things like Warhammer Quest was one of Andy's.
Okay.
And he did all the troll games, I think, which tells you something. But he always used to say fast and dirty by 5:30. That was kind of the philosophy.
Yeah. So your kind of role in GW, you're saying you were doing mailing and whatever, but like in a creative aspect, were you kind of primarily focused on, you can sculpt, apparently you're designing rules, doing a little bit of lore stuff. What do you think you spend the most time doing of those 3 categories?
Oh, it depends when you're talking about. I mean, when I first joined Games Workshop, I spent most of my time running around putting toy soldiers in boxes.
Sure, sure.
Packaging, yeah.
Yeah, undoing the mail, going through the mail, sorting out the check, because it's all checks in those days.
Yeah.
Doing the banking, taking this in, getting stamps, sticking stamps on things, going down to the post office. It was that.
Yeah.
And then very quickly I was doing the promotional flyers, because in those days every month you did a different promotional flyer. And to do the flyer, we got I think originally it was just on our typewriter, and Tony Ackland would stick all the pieces together on this is what you call camera ready copy. So you make drawings on bits of paper, cut them out, stick them onto big bits of paper, and it would then go off to a reprographics house, who would take effectively a photograph, it'd be turned into a film, and then it would be printed. And that was the technology I worked with. Pre-digital age. That was
Very
how
analog,
you did things. Yeah. And that was how we then, Tony and I, we did all that promotional material, including catalogues.
Okay.
And Brian always wanted to do something that was a traditional war game with role-playing elements. In those days, you couldn't sell a war game unless it had a role-playing element. D&D was enormous.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The whole idea of role-playing was big. You slap the word role-playing on something and you could sell thousands.
Interesting. Yeah.
So we tended to slap the word role-playing.
Have you checked out like the Fantasy Flight Games role-playing 40K stuff, like Death Watch, Only War?
Not really.
Okay.
I know someone who used to work on them.
Yeah. I love the books. They're great artwork, really well put together. The rules are clunky as fuck, but man, still, role-playing is so much fun. So what do? You just muddle through.
Yeah, I mean, I used to. I've not really done much role playing since my very early 20s. We used to do a lot of skirmish wargaming, which had kind of role playing elements, like progression and special abilities, and game to game kind of continuity, stories behind them, an umpire running it, that kind of thing. So I was always more of a skirmish wargamer than a role player. But that's where role playing came from.
Okay.
That's where D&D came from. And Gary Gygax was a wargamer before he was a role playing publisher.
Interesting.
So the whole concept of role playing was something which I'd kind of been there on first base, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And we'd gone off in our own direction a little bit. But I have written a couple of role playing games. Apart from Warhammer, well, I wrote Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but I also wrote the Judge Dredd role-playing game.
Okay.
For Games Workshop as a commission.
Cool.
So I can't believe it. But my idea of a role-playing game, a role-playing session, is something where the guy who's running it starts off by going, "You know the rules? Forget about the rules, because I am the rules."
Yeah. I am the law.
I've got some tables here. I've got some charts. I may roll on them. I may not.
Yeah. You're going to hear me rolling dice, but I promise you I'm not actually giving you the numbers I rolled.
Don't let it distract you.
That...
I might occasionally ask you to roll a dice. I'll ask you to roll a dice. You roll the dice, and whatever number you roll, I will go, "Ooh, that's bad."
Back in the day, it didn't seem like, you would kind of say it wasn't as focused on like competitive play or being balanced and stuff. It just seemed like you guys were trying to just have fun with it.
Yeah, I think that's essentially true. But the trouble is you can't sell that. You can't sell just make it up as you go along.
Sure.
If you're going to be involved in commercial role-play product, you have to have something that's got rules for everything, even though you wouldn't necessarily need or want rules for everything if you were doing it yourself. And you have to have that sense of all the stories being worked out to the nth degree, rather than vague and left to improvise.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, what are you selling people? A blank sheet of paper. So commercial role-playing games were always vastly overwritten, in my opinion. The original D&D was quite loose. I mean the original D&D. There was a white box and then a kind of a brown box version, which were phenomenally expensive here in Britain because they were imports.
Okay, yeah.
And those are the books. Yeah. I don't know if they're expensive in America, but that would have been late 70s.
Yeah, before my time.
before your time and only just within mine.
So how do you kind of approach designing a new game or designing a game then? That, like you're saying, there's that fine balance between, you got to have rules written down for people to actually buy and kind of understand, but at the same time, you got to allow for that creative aspect that we're all here for to bleed into the project. So how do you kind of design games with that kind of dual function?
I don't know, really. I just do it. I think the problem is I've been doing it for so long that I don't know how to do it. I've gone to that point of what you call unconscious competence. Yes, unconscious competence.
Yeah, for sure.
And because I've been doing it since I was a kid. I mean, it's not just published rules. I think my first set of published rules was with Richard Halliwell in 1978. I think 77 or 78. When we would be 18 or 19. I think 19 by the time they were published.
Okay. Yeah, like you've worked on a lot of different projects, not just with GW. Maybe I'll list a couple, and if I forget anything, you can expand on it. But yeah, you did Warhammer Fantasy Battle, Rogue Trader, a bunch of Warhammer stuff. But then you went on to co-found Warlord Games, and also you're involved in like Bolt Action and Hail Caesar. Like you've dabbled in a bunch of different areas here.
Yeah, and we did a Warhammer historical as well, and then I wrote War Master Games Workshop, which was one of the few games that I almost did as a solo project.
Warhammer historical, like
that's something I want to talk about. I saw a used copy of Warhammer Historical in an old games store, just like dust on it, tucked away in a corner. And I regret not buying it to this day because that thing is so rare now, and I don't think a lot of people even know that it existed.
I've never heard of it before until this conversation. So, like, give me a little sentence. What exactly was it?
Warhammer Historical. What happened was we did a new version of Warhammer in 1992. I think that would be the 4th edition. 1992. By that time, I was kind of running the studio, and I was pretty much Brian had sold the company, and I'd kind of stepped up in terms of management to become one of the 4 people running the company, and I was responsible for all of the product, including all of the tooling for plastics and the print buying and the legal side of it, everything we were doing in terms of licensing. For example, and we were doing Milton Bradley stuff at the time. So all that fell under my remit, which gave me quite a bit of latitude.
Yeah.
We did that new version of it's quite good, really. We did a new version of Warhammer, as I said, and the 3rd edition, the one it replaced, was incredibly complicated. It had been done at a time when we'd got more resources available. It was a beautiful thing, beautifully produced. A lot of people very fondly remember that edition, hardback book. But by the time we did the next edition, no one was playing Warhammer. Warhammer was pretty much dead because 40k had come along and pretty much taken away all the excitement and the zing. And this is something people forget, especially when they talk so fondly about Warhammer 3rd edition, the previous one, late 80s one. And then my problem with it was that it was largely unplayable. It was just too complicated.
Interesting,
too fiddly. Had a lot of detail in it, including pushbacks. If you had a goblin army like I did, and your units were 48 strong, let's say 12 by 4, individually based models, and you're in combat, and every time you lost a combat, you got pushed back 3 inches, it was a pain in the neck.
Yeah. There's a lot of little micromanagement moves all of a sudden.
I used to say, oh my God, here we go again. And I just felt the rules were really overwritten, clunky. And it had been a deliberate decision to make them that at the time, I must say. So when we came to this 4th edition, I rebased the whole game system. And then we started doing the army books. So that idea of doing the big box set, main core rule set, plus army books was something I introduced in 1992.
Okay. Well, then you're the guy I have to complain to about all these fucking faction codex every other day. Like we get the main rule book, and then you get supplements and codexes, and don't forget you got to buy your campaign books as well. So all that falls upon you.
We can come back to that because that wasn't my plan. But it's that's kind of what it happened in the end, because Games Workshop, well, to be honest, it's because we grew the business, and as we grew the business, it changed.
Yeah,
and as it changed, its needs and requirements changed. So it became...
I do like that style where you have your core rule book. That's where the rules are going to be, and then everything else you can find in an army book or whatever for your stuff. I do like it. It works really well.
And I didn't want to change it particularly, or to keep doing second editions, but but nevertheless, that's kind of what we did in 1992. And I thought the core game, the Warhammer Fantasy Battle's core game, was really strong. It suddenly became much more focused, much faster to play, and quite dynamic. And Jervis Johnson and I got together, probably over a cup of tea or something in the canteen, and we said, this new version of Warhammer would make a great set of ancient rules. And Jervis thought, well, that's not a bad idea, is it? Let's have a give it a go. So we got together with the Perrys, and I think they just made a set of Romans or something. They'd done a few things for Wargames Foundry. And we started playing ancient war games round at Alan Perry's house, using his collection of, I think it was Hittites and Egyptians to start with, and then late Romans. I can't remember what we played the late Romans against. Might have been other late Romans. It might have been Sassanids or something. It's something along those lines.
Yeah. And
we thought the games worked really well. And we organised some weekend campaigns. There's a little campaign system in Warhammer Historical. Okay. And they seemed to work really well. So we really enjoyed it. And Jervis and I thought, well, let's just write them up. So I think Jervis did a lot of the legwork, and then I wrote the thing up.
So Warhammer Historical was kind of the concept of, taking historical armies. Like, what would happen if the Roman army went up against Japanese samurai? Was that kind of the concept of it, or
ancient war games, the tradition of ancient war gaming has always been you fight anything against anything.
Yeah.
Because if you've got a let's say a late Bronze Age Egyptian army, you're only going to be able to play that against historical opponents. Well, you run out very quickly. And if your mate's got a Roman army, you just fight each other, don't you? It's all pointy sticks, for goodness sakes. The technological basis of warfare doesn't change from the late Bronze Age, or even the mid Bronze Age, really, up until the potentially late medieval period.
Yeah,
I tend to draw a line back the 13th century. I think the technology starts to become distinct after that.
Interesting. It's interesting in human history how we get such long periods of time where nothing really changes, and then you get these brief little moments where it's like jumps up. And even just right now in our modern time, we're in one of those moments where the technology is taking us somewhere else now all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But
were we to have World War III, and let's hope we manage to avoid that.
Yeah.
But were we to have World War III, I think it'd be a bit like the First World War insofar as all the assumptions would very quickly wash out.
Yeah.
And Lord knows how it would work. You might find that the battlefield weapons are irrelevant in a war that's largely fought technologically.
Yeah.
Online even.
Cyber.
To some extent. I mean, if you can sabotage or close down somebody's nuclear power stations from a button on the other side of the planet.
Yeah. Cyber warfare,
seems
drone
like a
warfare.
Solution.
That doesn't make for a great tabletop gaming experience, though, eh?
I sense not. But we
on a D6, you sabotage the reactor and you win the game. Just one dice roll and you're
well
done.
Hurrah! That's a bit like in 40k, where originally I think people rather took my suggestions about planetary bombardments and viral bombs a bit too seriously. They started to go, I'm just going to drop a viral bomb on this planet.
Yeah, why do we even have to fight?
Win the game. Hooray.
Yeah, that's a fun misconception of 40k, that the Imperium's just going around dropping virus bombs, orbital bombardments on every planet they don't like, but it's a pretty rare situation, really. It's not the go-to move.
No. And I mean, when I conceived of the 40k universe, I thought of it as a very fragmented medieval universe where nobody really knows what's going on, and the Emperor doesn't know what's really going on because he lives in this sort of, if he exists at all, lives in a kind of a semi-dream state, occasionally rousing into consciousness, not really and his relationship with the organizations within the Imperium being largely driven by almost like a bunch of psychics, guys with tarots and crystal balls, and they don't know really what is going on. So the whole thing being a bit vague and messy. And the reason why I always conceived of there being 1,000 chapters of Space Marines was because they're spread out, so they can kind of deal with local problems insofar as 100 light years is local.
Sure.
It was a medieval universe in space as it's conceived.
So that's very interesting. Like, so you kind of mentioned you intentionally came up with the 1,000. It was kind of always my thought that those 1,000 were created so we could kind of have our chapter made, where GW makes theirs, and then we could have ours. That as well. Okay, that's good to know. But it's also kind of interesting, like, okay, yeah, so your concept was the chapters, they're in very specific locations, and they probably don't leave that area necessarily.
Why would they?
Why would they?
What happened, of course, was Games Workshop decided that we must have these campaigns which are run across their stores, where everybody has to fight everybody. So suddenly the Space Marines at one end of the galaxy are fighting the Space Marines from the other side of the galaxy.
Why are Space Wolves and Tau fighting? They are not close to each other.
So it utterly destroys any concept. It's a bit like in a World War II game in which the Japanese turn up and have a go at the French. Not in Indochina, but in France. That sort of thing. It kind of makes no real sense at all. It's an abstract. So the thing I'd set up immediately got ruined, if you like. But on the whole, people don't care.
That's a minor criticism, that one, of having Space Marines anywhere across the galaxy. But
it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's maybe move on to other things you've done outside of Games Workshop. You're working with what company nowadays, and what are you kind of up to?
Well, right now I've been working with a chap called John Wombat, almost certainly not his real name, who runs his own publishing business, which is Amazon based. And I came up with a spaceship combat game. Ironic, isn't it?
You've come full circle, eh?
A spaceship combat game, and I just call it Space Battles: A Spacefarer's Guide.
Cool.
And it's something I just put together a couple of years ago as a little bit of a side project. Not a serious. I never intended it to be a commercial game. I thought I'd just play it a little bit and have some fun. And I got talking to John Wombat about it, and he said, "Oh, I'll publish it for you." So he has. So it's available via Amazon. If you just go onto Amazon and search for Space Battles: A Spacefarer's Guide, you'll find it.
Cool. How different is it nowadays, like making a game and getting it to publish, than it was back in the day? Like now it seems like there's a lot of different channels, or is it still pretty tough?
Yeah. Well, the equivalent of what I've just done would have been printing something in a fanzine.
Okay.
Because fanzines existed back in the day, and a fanzine would be, a sheaf of, I say, Ronia Stat paper, wet copied paper. Do you know what those are?
Not fully, no.
Okay. Well, when you had an old-fashioned typewriter, you could put a sheet of copy paper in. The copy paper has wax on the back. You type your piece onto it. Then you take that wax copy, you put it onto a drum, you fill the drum with ink, you roll the ink round, put a piece of paper through, and you get a print. You do that about 50 or 60 times, and you get 50, 60 copies of that piece of paper.
Interesting.
You get 20 or 30 pieces of paper, you staple them together, that's a fanzine. You mail them up, send them to people who subscribe to it. And back in the day, that was the way in which people who were wargamers kept in touch.
Crazy.
So, yeah,
that's
other things.
That's quite the process, as opposed to nowadays of just copying and pasting. Control C. Yeah.
Analog world. That's how. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And that I subscribed to a newsletter called I think it was called Dragon's Lair, which was a fantasy-based newsletter in the mid-70s, and it was exactly that. And as I say, some people would have published rules in that fashion. just because they wanted to publish their own rules.
Yeah.
And then you went all the way up to something that would be published and typeset and whatever. But nowadays it's so easy to just get a copy of InDesign
Yeah.
and produce a professional looking. I mean, you could do something in it. You or I could do something with InDesign, or a Quark Express if you so wish. But InDesign's the one most people I think would go to.
Yeah. And like even now with AI artwork too, like you can not only design your rules, you can fill it with your artwork, and you could get a very finished product for sure.
Yeah, I think with AI generated artwork, you do have to have a little bit of skill to actually take that and turn it into something.
Sure. Like, yeah, you got to still do some photoshopping and some.
Yeah.
I just did an episode actually with an AI artist called Gothic Garnish. And
Right.
just he was talking about the process of, yeah, it's not just typing in Space Marine and then you get it. It's like you type in futuristic sci-fi warrior, then you got to also get your Aquila, slap those on, Photoshop those. It's a whole big process to get it right, but it's still very manageable for the average human.
And certainly someone who's got basic graphic skills.
Yeah.
Whereas back in the day, we would have had to have drawn something with a repeatograph pen.
Yeah. Now, but man, there is just nothing like the artwork that came out of GW's kind of early days. Like that's kind of John Blanche sketch work. Like that style is 10 out of 10, man.
Yeah. Well, and Tony Ackland, our original artist was Tony.
Okay.
And then John Blanche joined us fairly quickly, actually. So it was me, Tony Ackland, and John Blanche. We shared the very original Citadel studio. Was just us three.
Cool.
And we just and we were away from the factory by then. We'd actually hired a little office around the corner.
Nice.
So and Tony would draw all those, and he drew all the catalogue art as well. The little diagrams for the catalogues.
Yeah.
So he established the, and we had a few other contacts who drew for us, including Nick Bibby. A young Nick Bibby,
okay,
who was a friend of Brian's. But Brian Ansell, based in Nottingham, he was really the centre of a lot of these things. He drew people in together, and he created a company called Asgard Miniatures when he was about 2021. So he had a core of people he knew, and then he published games with Bob Connor in tabletop games. That was in Arnold, in the north of Nottingham. So really, Brian was the focus of a lot of these things, and he provided a lot of drive.
Interesting.
Even if he didn't later on do a lot of the work himself, he was often pushing these things.
Yeah.
Including 40K. Once it became obvious it was going to succeed.
Yeah.
He was very onto it. In fact, he wrote a couple of, maybe even ended up being 3 books about the orcs. I don't know if you've seen those. War of the Orcs, Freebooters, and Here We Go, I think.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
How does working with like other game companies kind of compare to GW?
Well, again, the companies I've worked with since, it's been in a more modern era, so the production's different.
Sure.
But Warlord Games is a lot like Citadel was way back, because they still work to a fairly tight schedule. They take the finances quite seriously. They make sure that they can pay people the wages and meet their a lot of game back in the 70s. I don't think a lot of games companies did. They go spectacularly bankrupt very quickly because no one counted the money.
Yeah.
Or worked out how much money you were making when you sold something.
Huh.
I don't think the Perrys still do.
Now I think that's GW's first question. How much money are we going to make off this mini? That's seems like.
Oh, you've got to make a minimum of so much. I think it was about you aim for 70%.
Oh, interesting. Margin. Wow. Okay, good to know.
Yeah. When I produced the big box games in the 1990s, these would be selling for about £40. My budget for the content was £5 or £5.50.
Crazy.
Everything, including the wrap that it went in, could cost no more than £5.50.
Crazy.
That's not costing the labour.
Yeah.
That's just costing the.
Yeah.
That's the gross margin.
The product. Yeah.
Man, so GW has been fucking hustling me then for years. They've been just raking in the money off me.
Well, you mustn't compare. You mustn't. Making a gross margin and making the net margin are 2 different things entirely.
Sure.
If you've spent £250,000 making a tool, you have to amortize that cost against something.
Yeah.
Often there were times when we were making nothing in the, was it 2000s? Yeah, in the 2000s when we were really making nothing, largely because we were expanding too quick. We were expanding ahead of the market.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
And that meant that sometimes you got lots of expenses, and sometimes you created new cost centers, particularly in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Hong Kong, eventually Australia. We started creating new cost centers.
Yeah.
America was already part of the business when I joined, in fact.
Yeah.
In fact, two of the guys that ran Games Workshop in London were American from Baltimore, and that's why Games Workshop ended up in Baltimore.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Are you happy with where the tabletop gaming industry kind of is? Has it changed for the better, you found? Like, technology makes it all easier, but is that better?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? It's certainly a lot bigger than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certainly some technologies that are really very impressive, mostly 3D design and printing.
Yeah.
And it's made a huge difference to the Warmaster community, if you can call it a community. Warmaster is a game I wrote in 2000, I think, and it was very well liked by a small community. It's hard to describe something's very popular when it was obviously not very popular, but there was a great enthusiasm for it.
Yeah.
Amongst the people that liked it.
It's a cult classic.
And they stuck with it. And it's the only game that I've played, the only Games Workshop game that I've played since I left Games Workshop as a Warmaster. And I took part in a few tournaments, in fact, after.
Cool.
Nice.
And I made some good friends in that community too.
Yeah.
But it seems to have had a sudden renaissance, and I think it's because of 3D printing, as well as that core enthusiasm.
Sure. 3D printing, man, it's a game changer. Like, I live down in Panama on a island, like boat access only. My neighbors don't have electricity, but I could buy a 3D printer tomorrow, have it shipped to me, and be printing plastic miniatures or Lego blocks or whatever I want to be printing out in the middle of nowhere. I could have my own little warehouse manufacturing station.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
It's crazy.
I've not taken the plunge yet. I think you need a certain minimal level of IT competence, which is probably a little bit beyond me.
Yeah, like there's like the two aspects. It's like designing. Yeah, you definitely need some skill to be designing miniatures. But to just be downloading and printing STL files, I feel like when they came out 5-6 years ago, these printers, there's a lot more technical, like make sure your beds are level. There was a lot more technical stuff going on where when I talk to printers nowadays, it seems like it's very much just press print and you're going to be good to go. Like That's
what I'm waiting for.
I think we're there, man. From like everyone I talk to in the community, it seems like, a lot of the messy work or hassle has been taken out now.
Yeah. Well, bear in mind, I've been involved in the whole scanning and printing business since I was at Games Workshop, because we worked very closely with some, I can't remember the name of the company now, but on a company that was pioneering the scanning techniques. And we very quickly started to design things digitally.
Yeah.
And now Games Workshop only designs digitally.
Yeah.
So I remember all that. I remember seeing big 3-up models, like 3 times the size you actually want them, with dots stuck all over them, and then doing scans and working out positions from these dots. And nowadays, my dentist sticks a scanner in my mouth, scans my gums, and says, "Right, we can make you a new denture from that." I lost a tooth.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, how do you get the datum? And he says, "Oh, he just works it all out."
It just works it all out. Science.
He just works it all out. Yeah. Just a little probe in your mouth and it works it all out.
Yeah.
And that was the thing we struggled with, is trying to fix a datum on these scanning beds. Right in the 1990s, I'm talking.
Sure.
Yeah.
But now, Warlord Games, we design lots of things digitally.
Cool.
All the epic scale models, which are 15 millimeters, cool. They're all done digitally, and many of the vehicles done digitally.
Yeah.
And the tooling's done digitally. Whereas in the 1990s, when I was actually in charge of all that, all the tooling was done using 3-up models and physical pantograph machines.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
hardly anyone does it anymore.
Now it's crazy. Like people have made 3D printed heads of, me, Christian, and the other Lorehammer crew members, where they then slap them on Space Marines. And yeah, they just take a little picture, scan that shit in, and all of a sudden you're a Space Marine captain. The technology is just wild, man.
Could be worse. Could be a Gretchen.
Could be,
Could be a Grot.
Yeah. Slap you on an orc. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're still with Warlord Games, Rick?
Yeah. Warlord Games was actually founded in 2008. So it's before I left Games Workshop. It was actually founded by Paul Sawyer and John Stallard. So I didn't join until 2010. I was 2 years after. It had been going 2 years when I joined, but I'd already done a little bit of work for them, which I kind of got permission to do, to produce Black Powder, because the Black Powder game.
Okay.
I don't know if you know, but the Black Powder game, which Warlord's sort of Napoleonic system, it's their Black Powder system. That was originally going to be a Warhammer historical war games product. But what happened there was we kind of closed down Warhammer historical war games. It was never very popular amongst the senior management. It was always seen as a bit of a dog in the manger. So I could see which way it was going. So when John Stallard left Games Workshop, he asked if he could take that manuscript and produce it at Warlord. So I did then help him and Paul Sawyer to do all that.
Yeah.
Which was quite fun. But yeah.
Is there any game or genre that you kind of haven't dabbled in? Like, you clearly have a passion for historical stuff. Is there?
Not really.
No. Okay. Feeling satisfied with your career. That's nice.
Yeah, there's not much I've missed. The last thing really was, again, ironically, was that spaceship game. And the new one I've just done, I suppose it kind of scratches that itch. It's a very, I would say, simple is perhaps a slightly misleading word, but it's a fairly simple game, insofar as the mechanics are quite straightforward. A lot of science fiction ship games are terribly, terribly complex. They have lots of recording and detail and fiddle. I didn't want to do. I actually wanted to produce a game that was relatively simple. I just want something I wanted to play. So that probably does scratch that itch after all those years. Apart from that, not really. I mean, maybe the inspiration will take me to do something else at some point. Often you get an idea that's based on a mechanic. You come up with a mechanic, or you see something, and you go, that would make an interesting mechanic. I was talking to Nigel Stillman last night. Nigel worked with me at Games Workshop, produced many of the supplements for Warhammer, and he's done the odd thing for Warlord as well. But he's talking to me about a system he's come up with for a skirmish war game, which involves flipping coins endlessly, heads or tails. Though he describes it as based on an Egyptian game, which actually had little markers that were black on one side and white on the other. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. I wonder if you can actually buy markers that are black on one side and white on the other. And I think some versions of Othello have that. But other than that, I don't know. I describe it as a D2. If so, it'd be the only game that's ever been designed for a D2, I think so. But that's the sort of thing. You come up with an idea for a mechanic, and then it kind of, you think, well, how can I apply that?
Well, that's his niche market then, right there. So that's interesting. Then, because I was actually going to ask you, like, what do you consider yourself first? Like, are you a game maker, a storyteller, artist? Like, what? And you're saying right now it's like the game mechanics that seem to be what drives your creative process.
Oh, it can be either. You tend to wear different hats, as it were, and you sometimes. If I'm actually designing a game and I'm working on the mechanical aspects of that game, I'll tend to focus on that and get all that working smoothly. And as I'm doing that, a mechanical idea might throw up a background. You might need to justify something in terms of the background that you've already wanted to include mechanically. Conversely, if you start to mill around the ideas for the background, it might feed back into the mechanic, but I like to get the mechanics sorted first.
Sure.
And a game or two played, so that you've got the parameters for the game worked out. And then when it comes to the background, I'll tend to go, right, put the mechanics aside and just go on the background. So I tend to focus after one after the other. It's not that you're ever you're not aware of the other one being there, the need for mechanics behind the background or background behind the mechanics, but I tend to focus on the one at a time. And then there's also the thing you've got to think through in terms of the relationship with the models and then promotional aspects of it. And really, I've tended to work with other people on those all my life, so it's probably the thing I'm least good at.
Yeah.
But Warlord are very good at that. Warlord will handle the sales and promotion side is more important. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why although I'm quite happy with the Space Battles game, it's something that is, because it's produced via Amazon, you don't have that same promotional kind of relationship. So you're immediately going from being able to sell thousands or something to selling a few hundreds usually. But it's not. I didn't have ambitions for it anyway, so it's not really a matter. But that's where I think the difference is, and I wouldn't say I was good at that. But the other stuff, you just deal with it as you need to. Yeah. Quite enjoy it.
What do you think you're most proud of kind of creating or having your hand in?
Well, when I look at Games Workshop today, and it's a company that turns over gazillions and employs many hundreds, if not thousands of people in the UK and all over the world, I'm kind of quite proud to have played my part in that.
Yeah.
Because, would Warhammer 40,000 have happened if I hadn't been there, didn't it? I don't know.
Probably not, man. Probably not. Maybe you included one little detail that made it all kind of click, and I guarantee that's how it works, man.
It pretty much was. It's the foundation was laid.
Yeah.
I know if you go back and look at it, it doesn't look a lot like the 40k that is now. But we very quickly took that core and built around it, and we were motivated by what sold. To be crude, what people wanted was what we provided.
Space Marines looking at you, buddy. All day, every day.
Yeah. Space Marines. People want Space Marines. Let's make more Space Marines. And people want army lists, so let's do some army lists. So let's. People want to fight this as a battle game with more figures. Let's make it a battle game with more figures. What about the spaceships? Battlefleet Gothic. And Hal came up with Richard Halliwell came up with the Space Hulk game, which I think Brian sort of pushed him at, and so on, and ultimately it's become the thing that it is today. And as I say, if I'm proud of anything, it's the whole thing, and to have provided employment for all those people as well as enjoyment for a lot of gamers.
Yeah. Well, hats off to you, because without you, I wouldn't be podcasting. I would have still been just a filthy electrician breaking my back. And now I just talk about a fictional universe that you made up and, get a little paycheck out of it. So man, the impact that you've had worldwide is crazy to think about.
Yeah. Well, it's not just me. Obviously, it was a team, but I do like to think that there's a strand there.
Yeah, for sure, man.
That has led from that first thing to what we are now. When it comes to the actual products that I did, well, I have to be quite proud of that Warhammer 40,000 40k Rogue Trader book. But also, I think in terms of games, it's War Master. I think that game and the way that game is presented, and again, it's because I got left to my own devices. Nobody thought it was a big deal, and let Rick get on with it. It's irrelevant, sort of thing. And because of that, I got to produce that book in the way I wanted to produce it. Not as I'd originally intended, to be fair. It was going to be a big box set with plastics in it. But once I knew it was going to be a book, the way that book's produced, with its flow-through charts at the beginning of each chapter, the chapters, the way they're broken down, the summaries at the end, there's a summary at the back, which is the how you play this game point by point, 1.1, 1.2 points. Yeah. Logical game rules. And a glossary of terms and an index. It's got all that. How many other Games Workshop products have got that?
Yeah, not a lot.
No, absolutely none. And the reason is because you don't usually have time to do them. So I'm quite proud of that as the game I worked on.
Yeah. That's nice. Okay. I'll maybe have to look into it and maybe give it a whirl at one point. Like I've definitely been adjacent to it before, but never actually dabbled.
Yeah, well, if you go online, because Warhammer's become popular again, the people that are into it have produced a kind of player's fan version of the game, which is an updated rule set. I think it's called Warhammer Renaissance. If you just War Master Renaissance. I think if you just type in War Master, and you'll find the community immediately. Yeah. Cool. That's the way to do it these days, I think.
Yeah. We got a couple more questions before we end this.
Sure.
Let's jump to some of the harder questions. How do you feel the state of Games Workshop is right now? Are you kind of happy? Like you said, you kind of have distanced yourself from it when you left, but
yeah, I did. Well, having worked there so long and been so very closely involved, particularly with the development of the Warhammer World background and the 40k background, and I felt that it was time to say goodbye to that.
Sure, fair enough.
So I deliberately didn't look back, and so I can't really comment upon, other than to say that they're obviously being very successful commercially.
Yeah, they're thriving right now for sure. Whether the rules are broken or not or whatever, they're people are enjoying 40k, and that's the important thing.
Yeah. Well, here's a thing, and I say this as a person that writes the rule, is a rules writer as much as anything else. The rules matter far less than the models. If the models are fantastic, and from what I've seen of them, they are increasingly impressive. Also big. People like big models. People who are not me like big models.
We don't want miniatures, actually, technically speaking. We just can only afford miniature versions of what we actually want.
You want gigantas, whatever.
Yeah.
But people do like that, and it makes it very difficult as a rules writer, because the bigger the models, the more you're writing, the smaller your tabletop. In effect, it's why my current gaming projects are all based on 1970s 25mm figures that were made, when people used to sculpt these things out of lead. People like me, in fact, used to sculpt these things out of bits of lead and milliput and what have you. And it's because you can get a unit of troops into a small space, and therefore a small tabletop, which in my view is 8 foot by 4 foot, becomes a massive battlefield. Well, these days people are trying to play war games on tabletops that are 4 feet by 4 feet, which are tiny, using models that are the size of a G.I. Joe.
Yeah.
And you go, well, what sort of game's that?
Yeah, like I love Imperial Knights, but heaven forbid if I ever have to play an all-knight army. Like that's now we're not miniature wargaming anymore. We just entered into a different territory here.
So in a way, what Games Workshop is as a gaming experience is something that's moved a long way from what I personally enjoy. So I can't really comment upon it. If people do enjoy it, that's fantastic. People obviously do, because they buy the stuff in numbers, and I imagine Games Workshop will continue to churn out fantastic models and hopefully playable games for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Good luck to them.
Good luck to them.
Do you have any opinion or any statement on female custodies? I know lots of people like this.
I've only very vaguely heard about this, and in fact there was some tittle tattle about, because Amazon are going to be doing a TV based on the 40k universe, and there was some tittle tattle then about them being horrified there are no female Space Marines. The reason why we didn't really go big on making female figures, and we always made some, but the reason why we didn't go big on it in the 1980s and 90s was because nobody bought them.
Yeah, like I tell my wife all the time, like, man, you could be playing Warhammer. There are female factions out there, but guess what? You don't like Warhammer, and it's fine. You're a girl. Like that. Let me play with my tiny toys, man. It's not for everyone.
Yeah, you don't have to force people to play. It's not obligatory.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I always tell people too is like, yo, this is Warhammer. you don't want to be represented in Warhammer. Like, that is not, if you see parts of yourself in the Warhammer universe in the grimdark, maybe you need to work on something in your own life. Like, that's not the goal.
Yeah. No, praise the Emperor and all that. I always used to think that's a very odd thing about our mail order department, because when I was doing mail orders, I say in the 80s, we made this thing about the mail order department being run by trolls. And we drew little pictures of trolls running around putting things in boxes. And when we made a mistake, you always used to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, the troll's got it wrong. Troll Dave has got it." And it was a gag. But it was quite a friendly gag. You know, it kind of was meant to give the impression of that, you know, we're doing our best. And speaking as the primal troll, I never considered it insulting. But later on, the the mail order guys decided they didn't want to be trolls anymore. They thought it was demeaning. They all wanted to be space marines.
Boo.
And I said, you really want to be semi-lobotomized, hypnotized eunuch slave soldiers of an uncaring emperor?
Sign me up.
Oh, I see what you mean, guys. Yeah, sure, that's right.
That's so
Go
funny.
for it.
Yeah.
So it's you know, what is your take on the 40k universe? Do you think the Space Marines are heroes, or do you think they're some sort of tragic I mean, people talk about Space Marines being superhuman, but they're inhuman to some extent. They have to. The whole concept was that they give up their humanity to become the humanity's protectors. They are both better and worse than human beings. They are not human and as much as superhuman. And I think that gets missed.
Yeah, I always love that depiction of them as being like more monstrous than anything. They have qualities, of course, but they are
transhuman dread. That's the word I like to use.
Yeah, it's also one of the reasons why I kind of portrayed some of the chapters as their gene seed going a bit wild and evolving in ways which perhaps were not originally intended, and so you get things like the Blood Angels, who are semi-vampiric. Yeah, and because there's I came up with the idea of having an implant, which meant that if they would basically if Space Marine is to eat something, he gains the knowledge of it, or he can the understanding of it to some extent. And this quickly turns into a sort of zombified eating people's brains.
Once again, sign me up. Sign me up for that.
Yeah.
You know,
sign me up. I can do that. Yeah.
But yeah, like vampires are monsters.
Yeah, and you have the Dark Angels who were supposed to have done something so terrible you couldn't talk about it, and then Jervis went and talked about it, which I thought was a terrible mistake. Yeah, and it turned out not to be all that bad either, which I thought was a bit.
So you're a fan then of keeping the mysteries in 40k?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's always way more interesting if you can never know.
Yeah, no.
Because what is it?
Yeah, like I kind of chalk lore up into two categories. I chalk it up to like rule books and codexes, and then novels, and like they're very different. You know, where the codexes and stuff, we get that mystery, we get those writing prompts where you guys wrote one sentence, you're like, I wonder what happens next, I hope you guys do something with it, as opposed to just reading through the novel where you get all these intricate details and, oh, this guy now paints his helmet red because of X reason. It just bleeds into this whole crazy, now we know everything, which I have always kind of liked the codexes more.
Yeah, I didn't like the 40k fiction particularly, and I don't think I've read any of it, but people do like it. People do like it.
To each their own, for sure.
Yeah, well, people do like it,
but they're wrong.
Well, Dan Abnett in particular has been very popular, and all the Horus Heresy stuff's been fantastically popular. The Horus Heresy stemmed from a throwaway piece of colour text I wrote in the first supplement. You know,
so crazy to see what it's become now, where we have like 100 books and infinite amount of, like, I'm right now, we're on the Lorehammer podcast, we're doing Primarch and Legion episodes, and it's crazy. There's more information about Primarchs and their Legion in 30k, like there's more information on that era than there is on the 40k era stuff now, which is it's crazy to think that one sentence of myth turned into something so huge.
Well, the whole reason I set the origins of the Imperium 10,000 years before the present was to put it into a past that was so distant that it was an era of myth. I mean, can you imagine the world of 10,000 years ago? The world of 10,000 years ago,
I can't.
8,000 BC. You know, you're talking about the end of this ice age. You know, it's an inconceivable length of time in terms of human culture and civilization. And I did that to put it into the era of myth. And when I did describe some little bits of colour text or bits of fiction set in that world, I almost wrote it like heroic fiction. I tried to think in terms of the Iliad or in terms of Milton's Paradise Lost in particular.
Interesting.
And Horus, the whole story of Horus is just a parallel to the fall of Satan in Paradise Lost. It was just me riffing on that.
I love it.
Yeah. And that idea of like history and mythology, like could a character of Achilles have existed? Sure. Was he some godlike figure? Probably not. And you build that into the mythos of like, we don't really know who this Horus was, but the myth of him has lived forever.
Yeah, and in the Iliad, Homer sings, I suppose, speaks of the goddess. I can't remember, it was Athena catching one of the Trojan heroes by the heel and tipping him over. Things that just happened in the battle are ascribed to the gods.
Could the guy have just tripped?
Yeah, and so I took that as a trope, and I would have done things like that. But then when you start to write actual fiction set in the actual 30k universe, you destroy all that. But as I say, if people enjoy it, that's fine by me.
No, that's cool. I really like, to me, I'm a huge fan like of history and stuff, and knowing that you have a background in archaeology, like to me it's not an accident. No. A lot of the historical kind of Easter eggs that are just like all over the 40k universe.
It's having a perspective on time and culture and how these things interact and what human culture largely is capable of. It does give you it's a very good basis for creating worlds either in a fantasy or science fiction context, particularly in a fantasy context, really. I do think that was one of the things that enabled me to do what I did.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate it for sure. Like I said, that's kind of the biggest draw for me is all the historical aspects of it. Let's just launch the Crusades in space. Let's see what a Bronze Age civilization looks like in space, right? That to me is like the biggest draw. Yeah, and I think I would attribute a lot of that to you specifically.
Well, I think once I'd started it, other people would follow it. And often, certainly the World War II in space would have come in with people like Andy Chambers. He did a lot of that sort of thing. We were a fairly historically aware group of people. I mean, we had at least 3 people working for us with archaeology degrees.
Crazy.
So it wasn't really just me.
Yeah.
Nigel Stillman, he worked as a proper archaeologist. I only really did it casually for a little while. But Nigel worked on some of the excavations in London on the medieval plague pits, which must have been fun.
Cool. Yeah.
And he actually studied Egyptology, and he could actually speak and write ancient Egyptian.
Cool. Wow. So all the Tomb King stuff is real then.
Yeah. He's drawing on the real thing. Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. Cool. Yes, he's quite entertaining, is Nigel. And he later went on and did the historical war games supplements for it too. So
cool.
Yeah.
Well, we have one final question for you. You'd be ashamed to not ask a British person what his favorite biscuit was. So the people want to know what are you eating with your tea there?
Favorite biscuits. Well, I do quite like a hobnob. That's always a welcome biscuit.
Who doesn't?
Is that a biscuit in America? A hobnob?
No,
I don't think
I've never
is.
heard of it.
Yeah, hobnob, but it's sort of like a oaty biscuit sort of thing.
You heard it here first.
My wife wouldn't touch a biscuit unless it had chocolate on it. so there's quite a lot of chocolate biscuits around the Priestley household.
That's all right. Do you got kids too, if I can ask, or?
No, we don't. We've got lots of cats.
Lots of cats. That's just as good though. So just all those chocolate biscuits are for you then.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible, isn't it? have to buy larger and larger trousers every year to accommodate my biscuit habit. Yeah, no, that's I think that's it.
Well, what a crazy kind of conversation we had. We went pretty long, so I don't know. Let's maybe end it here. And yeah, thank you so much, Rick, for making the time, sharing a little bit about your insight into the early ages of 40K, man. Something that we've all just been so attached to. So very cool chatting with you.
Yeah, pleasure. So very good of you to listen to me rambling on, and I hope all you people out there in Radioland stayed awake. I didn't just skip right to the end here. I would never do that.
No, I think a lot of people, really love the universe and everything that you brought to it. A lot of people are super excited when they heard that we were going to be talking to you, talking to the Warhammer 40K. You are the Warhammer.
He is.
Yeah, gosh, I'm not sure I'm the Warhammer 40K. Well, it's great meeting you guys anyway. So it's really, really nice to speak to you. So
yeah, thank you, Rick.
You have a good day, Marcus and Christian.
Thank you.
And I hope,
we'll see you all later.
See you all later. Bye.
Adios.